Australia is hiding something in plain sight. Scattered across this continent, from the red desert interior to the rocky coastline of the northwest, there are structures that predate every civilization most people were ever taught to care about. Stone arrangements, engraved platforms, fish traps, painted galleries, geometric earthworks, some of them so large they are only legible from the air, some of them so precise they track the movement of the sun to the exact day. Most Australians have never heard of them. Most of the world has no idea they exist. That is about to change. The stone arrangements of the Western Desert. Something extraordinary is hiding beneath the desert sky. Across the Gibson and Great Sandy deserts, aerial surveys and satellite imaging have revealed elaborate geometric stone arrangements laid deliberately across the landscape in patterns that make no sense unless viewed from above, which raises an immediate and obvious question nobody has fully answered yet. These are not accidental formations. Stones are moved, arranged, and oriented with a consistency that rules out natural deposition. Some stretch hundreds of meters across flat red country where a single misplaced rock stands out like a typo on a clean page. Researchers describe an almost architectural intention in the way lines meet, curve, and terminate. Traditional owners have always known these arrangements exist. Many carry ceremonial significance tied directly to songlines, the navigational and spiritual pathways crossing the continent, encoding specific landscape knowledge into the arrangements themselves. The stones are not decoration, they are infrastructure, a technology for transmitting information across generations in a landscape where paper does not survive, but rock does. Dating every formation has proven difficult. Some appear periodically renewed, maintained by communities returning on the same ceremonial schedule across generations. The oldest confirmed arrangements in the Western Desert Cultural Complex push well past 15,000 years, placed during a period when the desert was wetter, greener, and considerably more populated than it appears today. The woody Yuang stone circle Victoria has its own answer to Stonehenge. Near Little River, southwest of Melbourne, an egg-shaped basalt stone arrangement sits on a low rise in open grassland, oriented to the setting sun at both solstices and both equinoxes simultaneously. One structure tracking 4 separate solar events with enough precision that accidental alignment is simply not a credible explanation. The Wathaurong people have always known what woody Yuang is. Their oral traditions describe it as a place of ceremony and meeting, built by ancestors and maintained as part of a living relationship with the land and sky above it. The stones are not small. Some weigh over 200 kilograms, placed without metal tools, without draft animals, and without wheels. Researchers from the Australian Archaeological Institute have confirmed the solar alignments are deliberate and precise. Current estimates place construction at a minimum of 11,000 years ago, making woody Yuang older than Stonehenge by at least 6,000 years. Nobody in a school textbook is making that comparison loudly enough. 11,000 years is also the conservative estimate. Some researchers studying the wider archaeological context of the Western Plains suggest the site could be considerably older. The people best qualified to speak to that question are the Wathaurong, who have been describing this site as ancient for as long as anyone has thought to ask them. The Marree Man. Nobody knows who made this. In June 1998, a pilot flying over remote South Australia looked down and saw a figure carved into the earth, stretching 4.2 kilometers from head to foot, one of the largest geoglyphs anywhere on the planet. A man in profile holding what appears to be a throwing stick, scratched into stony desert pavement with extraordinary precision. The Marree Man appeared overnight. No construction equipment was reported, no witnesses came forward, no organization claimed a responsibility. A buried American flag was found nearby alongside a jar, containing a note referencing Diana, Princess of Wales, and a quote from an American novel, none of which has ever been satisfactorily explained. I have read every theory. Not one of them holds together completely. If you know who did this, genuinely the comments are right there. What makes the figure remarkable beyond its scale is the line quality. It tapers correctly, swells where a body naturally widens, and maintains proportional accuracy across 4 kilometers of open terrain, something extraordinarily difficult to achieve without aerial guidance or sophisticated surveying. Locals have twice re-etched the outline as it faded. The South Australian government now partially protects it as a site of cultural significance, which is a genuinely fascinating bureaucratic outcome for a structure with no confirmed author. Australia, never boring. The fish traps of Brewarrina. These are among the oldest structures on Earth. At Brewarrina on the Gwion River in northwestern New South Wales, an interlocking system of stone fish traps extends across the river in a design so sophisticated that it effectively functions as a standing aquaculture system, channeling, catching, holding, and selectively releasing fish according to water level and season without any moving parts and without any need for daily reconstruction. The Ngemba people call these traps Biames Ngunhu, the nets of the creator being Biame. According to tradition, Biame himself laid the original design in the riverbed, and the Ngemba have maintained and renewed the structure across an unbroken span of time ever since. The traps are not simply a tool, they are a living monument to the knowledge system that designed them and the community that has never stopped tending them. Scientific dating of the Brewarrina fish traps has produced estimates ranging from around 27,000 years to 40,000 years old, which, if the upper estimate holds, would make them among the oldest human constructions of any kind that have ever been identified anywhere on the planet. That is not a fringe claim made by enthusiasts on the internet. That is the result of formal archaeological and geological analysis of the site. The traps were severely damaged during European settlement, particularly through deliberate interference by settlers who viewed the structures as obstacles to their own use of the river. Large sections were destroyed or displaced. What survives today is a partial record of something far more extensive, and the Ngemba's ongoing connection to the site carries the knowledge of what was lost alongside the knowledge of what remains. It would be worth pausing on that fact for a moment before moving on. The Walls of China. The name is a colonial joke that stuck. White lunette formations rising from Lake Mungo's edge in outback New South Wales were nicknamed the Walls of China by Chinese pastoral workers in the 19th century, and the name was never officially replaced. That tells you something about how Australia names things, and perhaps how thoroughly it has ignored what those formations are actually sitting on top of. Mungo National Park contains the oldest known cremation site in human history. Mungo Lady, discovered in 1969, was ritually cremated approximately 42,000 years ago, predating cremation practices anywhere else on Earth by a significant margin. Mungo Man, found nearby in 1974, was buried with ochre, indicating deliberate ceremony, also approximately 42,000 years ago. The lunettes themselves are not artificial, but they are why everything underneath survived, eroding walls, gradually exposing archaeological material across decades in what researchers describe as one of the most significant open-air sites anywhere on the planet. The Paarkantji, Muti, and Ngyampa peoples are the traditional owners of Mungo country. When Mungo Man was repatriated in 2017 after decades in a laboratory, traditional owners described it as a homecoming 42,000 years in the making. The science is remarkable. The human story beneath it is something else entirely. The Gwion Gwion rock art. Something happened in the Kimberley nobody fully explained. Across rock shelters and cliff faces throughout northwestern Western Australia, a body of painted figures exists so stylistically distinct from everything surrounding them that researchers have been arguing about their origin for over a century. They are called Gwion Gwion, also known by the colonial name Bradshaws, and they are unlike almost anything else in Australian rock art. The figures show people in motion wearing elaborate headdresses, carrying objects engaged in what appear to be ceremony or conflict. The line work is fine, the proportions are careful. One researcher described the style as though someone had turned up the resolution on everything else. Dating is technically difficult because the paintings cannot be directly carbon dated. Researchers instead date the mud wasp nests built over them, establishing minimum ages for the art beneath. That some figures are confirmed at least 17,000 years old. The fringe speculation surrounding Gwion Gwion always came down to the same thing. They looked, to colonial observers, like something made by someone else. The straightforward explanation, supported by the Wunambal Ga'ambera people whose country these paintings occupy, is that Gwion Gwion represent a distinct and extraordinarily skilled tradition produced by the ancestors of the people still here today. That answer, stated plainly, is more remarkable than any alternative theory ever managed to be. The Mount Ive stone circles South Australia keeps producing things nobody expected. Scattered across the Gawler Ranges in the state's northwest, dozens of small stone circles sit on open ground in arrangements that bear none of the hallmarks of natural geological deposition. They are too regular, too consistent, and too numerous to be dismissed as coincidence. No comprehensive formal excavation has been conducted at the Mount Ive formations. The pastoral station on which many of them sit has historically limited research access, which means the scientific record of these structures remains frustratingly thin for something this potentially significant. Local Aboriginal communities in the region have consistently described the circles as places of cultural importance, a description that has not always been given the weight it deserves. What is known is that stone circle traditions exist across multiple Aboriginal cultural groups throughout the continent, used for a range of purposes including ceremonial preparation, navigation, and the marking of significant events or territories. Whether the Mount Ive circles belong to a single tradition, multiple overlapping ones, or something not yet properly categorized, nobody has formally established. The circles just sit there, patient and unexamined, waiting for someone to take them seriously enough to look properly. The Dampier Archipelago petroglyphs. Most people have never heard of this place. On the Burrup Peninsula and surrounding islands of the Dampier Archipelago in Western Australia, there exists the single largest concentration of rock engravings anywhere on the surface of the Earth. Estimates of the total number of individual engravings range from several 100,000 to over 1 million images distributed across a landscape of dark volcanic rock on Australia's northwestern coast. The Murujuga rock art, as it is formally known, spans a time frame of at least 46,000 years, based on the archaeological and geological evidence available, making it one of the oldest continuous artistic records in human history. Among the images are depictions of animals now extinct, including the thylacine, also known as the Tasmanian tiger, rendered in detail that could only come from direct observation of a living animal. On the mainland, where thylacines have not lived for thousands of years, the Ngaluma, Yinjibandi, Matuthunira, Kurama, Malgana, and Yaburara peoples are among the traditional custodians of the Murujuga engravings, and the site carries active spiritual significance for these communities today. It was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2023, a recognition that arrived approximately 46,000 years later than the art itself, but better late than never. The Wanjina galleries, they have no mouths and they are watching you. Across hundreds of rock shelter sites throughout the Kimberley region of Western Australia, ancient painted figures known as Wanjina look out from the rock with large dark eyes, elaborate halo-like radiating headdresses, and a deliberate absence of any mouth whatsoever. They are among the most visually arresting images in all of Australian rock art, and they have generated more bad television than almost any other archaeological subject in the country. The ancient astronaut crowd loves the Wanjina. The halo reads as a spacesuit helmet to anyone determined to find one. The absence of a mouth gets explained as a communication device of some kind. This is not what the Wanjina are. The Murujuga peoples, whose ancestral tradition the Wanjina belong to, have always been clear that these are ancestral creator beings associated with rain, clouds, and the seasonal cycle, painted and repainted across generations as a living religious practice, rather than a historical record of a visit from somewhere else. The repainting tradition is itself one of the most remarkable aspects of the Wanjina galleries. Senior Murujuga artists periodically repaint the figures to maintain the spiritual relationship between the image and the being it represents, a practice that means the oldest Wanjina sites are simultaneously ancient and living. The date of the original paintings at individual sites varies considerably, with some galleries confirmed at over 17,000 years old. The tradition of caring for them has not stopped. The cathedrals of Cape York, far north Queensland, is hiding something most people drive past. Throughout the sandstone escarpments and sheltered overhangs of Cape York Peninsula, there are gallery sites containing some of the most extensive and oldest surviving rock art in Australia, accumulated across a span of at least 30,000 years in some locations, layers of different hands and different eras painted one over the other in a visual record of extraordinary depth. The specific challenge of Cape York's art sites is access. Many of the most significant galleries are located in terrain that is genuinely difficult to reach, particularly during the wet season when much of the peninsula becomes impassable to conventional vehicles. This remoteness has simultaneously protected the art from casual damage and kept formal scientific investigation frustratingly patchy. What has been documented is enough to make researchers describe the region as one of the most important rock art provinces in the world. What has not yet been documented may be more significant still. Among the most striking features of certain Cape York galleries are hand stencils produced by placing a hand against the rock and blowing pigment around it, a technique used across the continent but concentrated in certain Cape York sites in numbers that suggest the locations held particular ceremonial significance. In some overhangs, the stencils overlap so densely across the ceiling that the rock itself disappears beneath them, replaced entirely by the accumulated record of every hand that was ever pressed against it. That detail, if you sit with it for a moment, is genuinely extraordinary. The Panaramitee tradition. Engraving's one visual language crossed an entire continent. The Panaramitee tradition is a style of rock engraving characterized by pecked or ground images of animal tracks, circles, arcs, and geometric forms found at sites across South Australia, New South Wales, Queensland, Western Australia, and the Northern Territory, distributed across a geographic range so vast that a single cultural group could not plausibly have made all of them. What researchers have established is that the visual grammar of Panaramitee engravings is remarkably consistent across that entire range. The same motifs, rendered in the same technique, appearing in places separated by thousands of kilometers, in country belonging to different language groups, with distinct cultural traditions in every other respect. Something connected these communities, or something was transmitted between them across a span of time and distance that conventional thinking about pre-colonial Australia has consistently underestimated. Formal dating of Panaramitee sites has produced ages ranging from 10,000 to over 40,000 years, depending on the site and the method used. The oldest confirmed examples represent some of the earliest intentional mark-making ever recorded anywhere in the world. A tradition that old, spread that wide, and maintained with that degree of consistency is not a footnote. It is a chapter that most of the world's archaeology textbooks have not yet made space for. The Budj Bim eel traps. This one should have been famous for decades. In the Tyrandarra wetlands of southwestern Victoria, the Gunditjmara people constructed an elaborate aquaculture system of stone channels, weirs, and holding ponds, designed to farm short-finned eels on a scale that supported a large semi-permanent population in country that outsiders had always assumed was visited only seasonally. The system has been formally dated to approximately 6,600 years ago. That date means the Budj Bim aquaculture system is older than the Egyptian pyramids by at least 600 years, older than Stonehenge in its final form, and older than the earliest known urban settlements in Mesopotamia. It was built not by nomadic hunter-gatherers, which is how Aboriginal Australians were systematically and incorrectly described for most of the colonial period, but by a community sophisticated enough to engineer a permanent food production system capable of sustaining a settled population. UNESCO added Budj Bim to the World Heritage List in 2019, making it the first Australian site to be listed exclusively for its Aboriginal cultural values rather than its natural ones. That distinction matters. The listing formally acknowledged that the Gunditjmara had built something that warranted the same international recognition as the pyramids and the Great Wall, constructed independently and earlier than most of the structures it now sits alongside on that list. The Gunditjmara's connection to Budj Bim was never lost. Even through the violent dispossession of the 19th century, through the forced removal of community members, and through decades of formal denial that any of this had ever existed, the knowledge of what was built here survived. Because knowledge passed between people who care about it survives in ways that knowledge stored only in institutions does not always manage to. The Standing Stones of New England, northeastern New South Wales has a mystery nobody is talking about. Across the high plateau country of the New England tablelands, isolated standing stones have been documented in positions that appear deliberately chosen, placed upright in open ground, in arrangements that do not match the surrounding geology and do not correspond to any obvious natural process that would produce a vertical stone in an otherwise horizontal landscape. Formal investigation of these stones has been limited. The sites have attracted occasional interest from both mainstream researchers and less rigorous investigators, which has created a complicated public record where well-documented observations sit alongside speculative claims that are much harder to evaluate. What can be said plainly is that standing stones used deliberately in ceremonial or territorial contexts are a documented feature of multiple Aboriginal cultural traditions, and the dismissal of the New England examples as either natural formations or colonial-era fence posts does not hold up for every site on the record. The Hawkesbury River glyphs, less than an hour north of Sydney, a question sits in the sandstone. Across the river platforms and escarpments of the Hawkesbury region, enormous engraved figures have been cut into the rock surface by the Gwion people across a time frame that researchers estimate spans at least 15,000 years. The figures include whales, sharks, kangaroos, human forms, and at least one image that has been generating argument for decades because nobody can agree with confidence on what animal it depicts. The Hawkesbury glyphs are significant partly for their scale and partly for their context. This is not remote country. These engravings exist within the Greater Sydney Basin, within reach of one of Australia's largest and most visited cities, on open rock platforms that require no special equipment to access, and yet a significant proportion of the people who live within an hour of them have never heard they exist, let alone visited one. The fringe theories attached to the Hawkesbury engravings are elaborate and persistent, connecting them variously to ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, and extraterrestrial visitors, claims driven largely by the presence of certain ambiguous images that look to a determined imagination like things they are almost certainly not. The straightforward answer is better. The Gwion people created a body of art across thousands of years of continuous occupation of this country that is extraordinary enough without needing any external explanation attached to it. The Quinkan Gallery's traditional owners describe these as genuinely dangerous places. Near the town of Laura, in Cape York Peninsula, a complex of rock art sites contains figures known as Quinkan, spirit beings depicted in a distinctive elongated style with exaggerated limbs split feet, and an unambiguous sense of motion. The Angnara Aboriginal Corporation, which manages the most accessible of the Quinkan galleries, is careful to distinguish between sites open to visitors and those that are not. For reasons that go beyond simple conservation, the Quinkan galleries have been formally dated to a minimum of 15,000 years, with some researchers suggesting certain panels may be considerably older. They were inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage Tentative List in 2022 and are widely regarded by archaeologists as among the most significant rock art sites in the world, both for their age and for the continuity of the cultural tradition surrounding them. What makes the Quinkan sites distinctive is not simply the age of the art, it is the direct, unbroken line between the people who made it and the people who explain it today. Senior Angnara knowledge holders have described the Quinkan in terms that make it clear these are not historical curiosities, they are active presences in the landscape that require a specific kind of behaviour and a specific level of respect from anyone entering their territory. That framing is not metaphor, it is a careful, considered description of how this country is understood by the people who have always known it best. The Lake Eyre stone arrangements, nothing is supposed to be out here. Lake Eyre, now formerly known as Thanda, is one of the largest ephemeral lakes on Earth, filling with water only in rare flood years and sitting bone dry for most of its existence in a landscape of blinding white salt, flat surrounded by red desert country that appears from the outside to be entirely inhospitable to sustained human activity. It was not. Archaeological surveys of the Thanda region have identified stone arrangements in the surrounding country, placed in patterns that appear deliberately geometric, positioned on rises and ridges, in ways that suggest both intentional placement and knowledge of the wider terrain. The Arabana people, traditional owners of Thanda, have maintained a continuous relationship with this country across a span of time that makes the lake's reputation for emptiness look like a failure of outside imagination rather than a fact of the landscape itself. The arrangements are not extensively documented, the country is remote enough that systematic survey has been difficult, and the Arabana's own knowledge of what exists here has not always been sought in the way it should have been. What has been formally recorded is enough to confirm that people were marking this landscape deliberately in country that the colonial imagination assumed had never been meaningfully occupied at all. The Murujuga living archive scientists are using this rock art to track climate change. On the Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia, researchers from multiple disciplines have recognised that the density and time depth of the Murujuga engravings makes the site something genuinely without parallel anywhere in the world, not just as a cultural record, but as a physical archive of ecological and climatic change across 46,000 years, encoded in the species depicted and the way the art itself has been preserved or damaged by changing atmospheric conditions. Among the images at Murujuga are depictions of megafauna, large animals that went extinct in Australia many thousands of years ago, rendered with a specificity that could only come from direct observation. There are also images of coastlines, fish species, and environmental features that correspond to dramatically different sea levels, providing a visual record of what this part of the continent looked like when the ocean stood as much as 120 metres lower than it does today, when the land now beneath the ocean off Australia's northwest coast was dry ground and people were living on it. The threat to this archive is ongoing and real. Industrial development on and around the Burrup Peninsula has damaged sections of the engraving complex, and the debate over how to balance resource extraction with the preservation of an irreplaceable record of human history has been loud, unresolved, and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. The Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation has been vocal and specific about what is at stake. An archive 46,000 years in the making does not have a backup copy. The Pilbara Henge, Western Australia's Iron Country, has a question nobody is answering. In the ranges and rocky flats of the Pilbara, a circular stone formation has been documented by land users and local Aboriginal community members in terms that suggest deliberate construction and ceremonial significance, but which has not as of the time this script was researched, received the kind of formal systematic investigation that a structure of this apparent intentionality would warrant. The reluctance to investigate is partly logistical. The Pilbara is vast, access is difficult, and research priorities in Australian archaeology are shaped by funding constraints that do not always align neatly with what is actually most significant on the ground. It is also partly cultural. The traditional owners of the country where this formation sits have their own relationship with it, and formal scientific investigation of sacred sites requires consent, relationship, and time, none of which can be rushed without causing harm. What is known is that the Pilbara has yielded some of Australia's most significant archaeological material across decades of research, and that the region continues to produce findings that revise the timeline of human activity in this country upward with unsettling regularity. The circular formation sits in that context, unexamined, in country that has already surprised researchers more than once. The Sturt Stony Desert arrangements, some of these only make sense from above. In the Sturt Stony Desert of northeastern South Australia, a landscape of gibber plain, flat, covered in small rounded stones baked to a dark varnish by tens of thousands of years of sun, researchers and pilots have documented stone arrangements whose full pattern is only legible from altitude. From the ground, they look like scattered rock. From the air, they resolve into geometry. The question this raises is not supernatural. Aboriginal communities across the continent maintained detailed knowledge of landscape features across enormous distances, transmitted through song, through ceremony, and through the same walking of country generation after generation that produced the songline network crossing the continent. Designing and reading a pattern at landscape scale does not require flight. It requires the kind of deep systematic knowledge of terrain that accumulates across thousands of years of continuous occupation. What these arrangements were for is not publicly known. The communities whose country this is carry that knowledge, or carry the knowledge of what was lost when the communities were disrupted. Both outcomes deserve to be acknowledged, and neither should be collapsed into a convenient mystery for outside observers to project their own explanations onto. The living structures, here is the thing that matters most. 20 structures scattered across this continent, each one labelled a mystery by this video's title and by countless articles written about them. And yet, for most of these places, an explanation already exists. It has always existed. It lives with the communities whose ancestors built, painted, engraved, and cared for these sites across spans of time that make every other ancient monument on Earth look like a recent renovation. The explanation is not always available to outside researchers, and the reasons for that are entirely legitimate. Some knowledge is sacred, which means it is not public, which means a researcher hitting that wall is encountering a boundary rather than an absence. A closed door is not the same thing as an empty room. These structures appear mysterious primarily to people who have not yet asked the right questions of the right people with the right degree of genuine respect. What is actually extraordinary here is not that these sites are unexplained, it is that they represent the longest continuous cultural tradition in human history. People on this continent have been building, painting, and engraving structures for at least 65,000 years. The Egyptian pyramids are 4,500 years old. The oldest site in this video predates them by a factor of more than 10. Australia is not a country with a short history and a few interesting rocks. It is a continent whose human story is the deepest, longest, and most extensively evidenced of any place on Earth, written not in ink but in stone, in ochre, and in the living knowledge of communities that have never left. These are not ancient mysteries. They are the clearest evidence imaginable of what human beings are capable of when they have enough time and enough reason to build something that lasts.